Hello, dear listeners. Welcome. Today, I'm here with a story that will take away all the fatigue of the day and lull you into a peaceful sleep. Before we get to the story, if you'd like, share what makes you happiest in life in the comments. I love connecting with you all. You can support me by subscribing. Now relax. The story is about to begin. Chapter 1. Final Stop. The fog settling over London that morning was heavier and wetter than usual. The railway tracks stretching from the city's outskirts to the centre lay like ghostly lines beneath this white blanket. When the last train on the suburban line connecting to Victoria Terminal pulled into the platform a few minutes past 7, the steam rising from the locomotive's chimney mingled with the fog and dissolved into the sky. Harold Finch was a 32-year veteran of the railroad. He knew this line like the back of his hand. Every curve, every bridge, every stop. Watching the train pull into the platform at this early hour, his face wore its usual expressionless look. Routine was a comfort to him. Doing the same tasks at the same time every morning was proof that the world was turning, and everything was in order. When the train stopped, the doors of the carriages opened one by one. The passengers poured onto the platform, shoulders hunched against the morning cold, their faces bearing the traces of sleeplessness and Monday blues. Finch began walking, as usual, to check each car one by one. The first car was empty. In the second car, an elderly woman was struggling to gather her belongings. Finch helped her, and she smiled gratefully as she got off. When he reached the third car, Finch's steps slowed. A man was sitting in the middle compartment. His head was tilted slightly to the side, his eyes closed, his hands resting loosely on his knees. Finch had seen this scene countless times before. Passengers who fell asleep on long journeys, missing their destination. But this man was different. Finch didn't know he was different yet. He just felt a vague uneasiness. "Sir?" Finch called out, tapping lightly on the compartment door. "Final stop, sir. Victoria Terminal." The man didn't stir. Finch frowned and took a few steps closer. The man's face was pale, but in the dim light of morning, everyone's face looked pale. Maybe he was in a deep sleep. Maybe he was drunk. Finch had encountered situations like this before. "Sir, please wake up." This time his voice was louder and more determined. "The train ends here. You need to get off." Still no response. Finch touched the man's shoulder lightly. The moment he touched him, his uneasiness turned into something tangible. The man's body was cold. He was slumped in his seat with a lifeless heaviness. Finch withdrew his hand and took a step back. In his 32-year career, he had only encountered death a few times. A heart attack, an accident, a suicide. But none had been this quiet, this calm. The man looked as if he were sleeping, as if he might open his eyes any moment and ask, "Where am I?" But Finch knew. With 32 years of experience, he knew for certain. This man was dead. The police arrived at the scene within half an hour. 2 young officers cordoned off the area around the carriage, while an inspector entered the compartment. At the other end of the platform, a few people had gathered, watching the scene with curious glances. News of a death at Victoria Terminal in the early hours of the morning had already begun to spread in whispers. Inspector Reginald Carter was a man in his mid-50s with weary eyes. He had worked at Scotland Yard for over 20 years and had encountered countless cases like this. Suicides, accidents, suspicious deaths. Each had its own atmosphere, but they all had one thing in common: paperwork, reports, and a case to close. When Carter entered the compartment, the first thing he noticed was the man's posture. He was sitting in his seat, his head tilted slightly to the right, his face showing no expression of pain or fear. It was as if he had fallen asleep and never woken up. Carter knew these kinds of deaths: sudden cardiac arrest, brain hemorrhage, sometimes drug overdose. Quiet, peaceful, almost serene deaths. "Does he have any identification?" Carter asked, turning to the officer beside him. The officer handed him a wallet taken from the man's pocket. "Daniel Moore, sir. 52 years old. His address appears to be in the Whitechapel area." Carter nodded and examined the wallet. A few banknotes, a business card, and a folded piece of paper. Carter unfolded the paper and read it. His expression remained unchanged. "A suicide note," he said quietly. "I no longer have the strength to go on. Everything has become too much. Don't blame anyone." The officer raised his eyebrows. "Suicide, sir." Carter refolded the paper and placed it in an evidence bag. "It appears so, but an autopsy will be needed for a definitive conclusion. Call Dr. Harrington." Dr. Harrington, Scotland Yard's senior forensic pathologist, arrived at the scene within an hour. He was a man in his 60s with a thick moustache and a calm demeanour. Carter met him at the door and briefly summarised the situation. When Harrington entered the compartment, he first examined the man's general appearance. Then he put on his gloves and began a systematic examination. Eyes, mouth, neck, chest, arms, legs. He checked each limb individually, took notes, and occasionally grunted thoughtfully. 15 minutes later, he stood up and turned to Carter. "Initial findings," Harrington said, removing his gloves, "point to sudden cardiac arrest, no signs of trauma, no signs of beating, no signs of suffocation. I see no evidence of any external cause." Carter shook his head. "Poisoning?" "No clinical signs," Harrington said, "but I'll take a blood sample for the toxicology report. It'll take a few days." "There's a suicide note," Carter said. "It came out of his pocket." Harrington raised his eyebrows but made no comment. He'd been doing this job for years, and knew suicide notes didn't always reflect the truth. But he also knew that sometimes the note was the only truth. People got tired, people gave up, and sometimes they quietly closed their eyes on a morning train and never opened them again. "The autopsy report will be ready in a few days," Harrington finally said. "But my initial assessment points to natural causes. Probably a heart attack." Carter pulled his notebook from his pocket and jotted down a few notes. "Any witnesses?" he asked, turning to Finch, who was waiting by the train door. Finch stepped forward, twisting his cap nervously in his hands. "I found him, sir. Harold Finch, conductor. When the train reached the last stop, everyone got off, but this gentleman remained. I called out. He didn't answer. I touched him and realized he was cold." "Did you notice anything during the journey?" Carter asked. "An argument, a noise, anything unusual?" Finch shook his head. "No, sir. I usually stay in the front car. I only check the middle compartment at the final stop." "Have you seen this man before?" Finch paused for a moment. "Yes, sir. I see him every day. He takes the same train every morning, at the same time in the same compartment, even in the same seat. A creature of habit, I'd say. He's been doing this for years." Carter furrowed his brow. "The same seat every day?" "Yes, sir. The window seat in the middle compartment, on the right side facing the direction of travel. I saw him there every morning. He was there yesterday. He was there today. Only today. He didn't get up." Carter scribbled something else in his notebook. Any other witnesses? Other passengers? The officer stepped forward. We took statements from a few passengers, sir. Most didn't notice the man. But one? The officer looked at his notes. A gentleman named Walter Price. He says that during the trip, a man was glaring at Moore. His name is Thomas Garrett. Carter's eyes lit up. Glaring? What does that mean? According to Price's statement, Garrett glared at the man as he passed by. He kept turning back to look at him intermittently for several minutes. Price found it strange, but didn't intervene. Carter closed his notebook. Find this Garrett and get his statement. But first, let's do this. Move the body to the morgue. Wait for the toxicology report. Search the man's home and workplace. If it's suicide, we need to find a motive. If not, Carter didn't finish his sentence. If it wasn't, things would get complicated. And Carter didn't like complicated things. Daniel Moore's body was taken to Scotland Yard's morgue. The compartment was sealed and the train was pulled into the depot to be prepared for its next journey. The platform slowly returned to its daily bustle. For most people, the morning's events were just gossip fodder. Carter went to Moore's address in Whitechapel that afternoon. A small room on the second floor of a 3-story boarding house on a narrow, dimly lit street. The landlady, Mrs. Sullivan, a widow in her 60s, had red eyes when she opened the door. "I heard," said the woman, ushering Carter inside. The neighbours said, "A train accident." "Not an accident, ma'am," Carter said softly. "Mr. Moore was found dead on the train. It appears he may have taken his own life." Mrs. Sullivan's eyes widened. "Suicide, Daniel?" The woman shook her head. "No, that's impossible. Daniel was quiet, withdrawn, but suicide? No." "How long have you known him?" 5 years, the woman said. "He's been here for 5 years. He pays his rent on time every month, never causes any trouble, never argues with anyone. A quiet man. A lonely man." "Did he have any family?" Mrs. Sullivan shook her head. "Not that I know of. He never had any visitors. He never received any letters. He just went to work and came back. He left early in the morning and came back late at night." "What did he do for a living?" "He used to work at a logistics company," she said, "but I don't know what he's been doing in recent years. We didn't talk much." Carter surveyed the room. It was small, plain, almost characterless. A bed, a table, a chair, a wardrobe. No pictures on the walls, no photos on the table. Just a few books, a few newspapers, and a stack of papers. "I'll need to examine his belongings," Carter said. "Official procedure." Mrs. Sullivan nodded and left the room. Carter began searching the rooms systematically. In the wardrobe, a few suits, all dark, all plain. In the drawers, underwear, socks, handkerchiefs. On the desk, a few old newspapers, an inkwell, a few used envelopes. Carter examined the envelopes. They were all empty. No addresses, no names. As if someone had taken the letters and left the envelopes behind. He found a notebook in the desk drawer. He opened it and flipped through the pages. Most were blank, but there were short notes on a few pages. Dates, numbers, names. Carter couldn't figure out what they meant, but he took the notebook as evidence. He found nothing else of interest in the room. As the room of a man who had committed suicide, it was exactly as he had expected. Lonely, simple, ready to be abandoned. That evening, Carter wrote his report. Daniel Moore, 52 years old, residing in the Whitechapel district. Found dead on the morning of November 14, 1893, on a commuter train arriving at Victoria Terminal. Suicide note found in his pocket. Initial autopsy findings indicate sudden cardiac arrest. No signs of trauma or assault. Toxicology report awaited for possible poisoning. One witness stated seeing a man glaring at the deceased during the journey. This individual, Thomas Garrett, will be interviewed. No suspicious items found at the deceased's residence. Initial assessment. Suicide probable, limited suspicious elements. Carter signed the report and closed the case. Tomorrow he would take Garrett's statement, wait for the toxicology report, and most likely close the case as suicide, no investigation required. What he didn't know was this. The next morning, on the other side of London at 221B Baker Street, a man would be reading the newspaper and notice a detail in a small sentence that everyone else had missed. And in that moment, Daniel Moore's death would cease to be a simple suicide. Chapter 2. The Newspaper Article. Morning light streamed through the heavy velvet curtains into the sitting room at 221B Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes, sitting in the armchair in front of the fireplace, was reading the newspaper in his hand, occasionally taking deep puffs from his pipe. The tobacco smoke formed a heavy layer in the air of the room. This was an indicator proportional to the intensity of Holmes' thought process. Dr. John Watson sat at the breakfast table, eating his eggs and bacon while observing his friend. Holmes had a strange air about him this morning. Normally, he would quickly scan the newspaper, read aloud any news that caught his interest, or make dismissive comments. But today he was silent. He was turning the pages slowly, examining each one carefully, as if searching for something. "Is there something interesting?" Watson asked, taking a sip of his tea. Holmes didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on a small article on the 5th page of the newspaper. Watson recognized that look. It was a sign that something was turning in his friend's mind, that the pieces of a puzzle were starting to fall into place. A few more minutes of silence passed. Then Holmes folded the newspaper and placed it on the table. He turned to Watson, a familiar gleam in his eyes. "Watson," said Holmes, a suppressed excitement in his voice, "would you do me a favor? Take this newspaper and read the small article on the 5th page. The headline reads, 'Tragic Death on the Train.'" Watson raised his eyebrows but did not object. He took the newspaper, turned the pages, and found the article in question. It was a short piece squeezed into the corner of the page, perhaps 15 lines long. Watson began to read aloud. "Tragic death on train. A man was found dead yesterday morning on a commuter train arriving at Victoria Terminal. 52-year-old Daniel Moore was discovered lifeless in his seat in the middle compartment. Initial findings indicate the death was caused by sudden cardiac arrest. A note found in the deceased's pocket reportedly read, 'I no longer have the strength to go on.' Police are treating the incident as a suicide. Moore was known to be a regular passenger who took the same train every day and was found in the seat he used daily. Funeral arrangements are ongoing." Watson put down the newspaper and looked at Holmes. "A tragic event," he said. "But unfortunately, it's not uncommon. People sometimes can't take it anymore and—" "Did you notice where you paused, Watson?" Holmes interrupted. Watson looked at him in surprise. "The place where I paused. While reading the news, you pause for a moment at the last sentence. He was found in the chair he used every day. That sentence made you pause for a moment too, didn't it?" Watson reread the article. "Well, yes, I suppose so. It's a slightly odd detail. but it's probably just the reporter adding colour to make the story more dramatic. Holmes stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the streets of London were filling with the morning crowd. Cars, pedestrians, vendors. But Holmes wasn't seeing any of that. His mind was elsewhere. "That's exactly it, Watson," said Holmes, looking out the window. "Why did the reporter add that detail? In a suicide report, why would it matter which chair the man was sitting in? Why would the police share that information?" "Perhaps it was just a coincidence," said Watson. "Or routine information." Holmes turned and looked at Watson. His eyes had that familiar, sharp look, the look of a hunter who has spotted his prey. "Coincidence," said Holmes. "No, Watson, this is no coincidence. This is a clue, and the journalist gave it away without realizing it." Holmes returned to his chair in front of the fireplace and sat down. He joined his fingers in a tent shape, rested them on his lips, and began to think. Watson knew this posture well. It signalled that Holmes had plunged into his sea of thought, that the invisible gears of his mind had begun to turn. "Think about it, Watson," Holmes said finally. "A man takes the same train every day at the same time, in the same compartment, in the same seat. It's a habit, a routine. And then one day, he dies in that very seat. The question is it a coincidence or is it calculated?" Watson frowned. "What do you mean?" "A person who commits suicide," said Holmes. "Why would they commit suicide in the seat they sit in every day? Suicide is a moment of decision, Watson. A breaking point. When people commit suicide, they usually break their routines. They go somewhere different, do something different. Because suicide is a rejection of life, and life is made up of routines." "But some people might do the opposite," Watson objected. "Maybe the man wanted to spend his final moments in a familiar place, somewhere he felt safe." Holmes shook his head. "Possible. But now, let's move on to the second question. The suicide note. What's in the note?" Holmes took the newspaper and reread the relevant part. "I no longer have the strength to continue." What does that sentence tell you, Watson? Watson thought. Exhaustion, burnout, the feeling of being unable to go on with life. "Correct," said Holmes, "but it also says something else." "Nothing." Watson looked at him in surprise. "I don't understand." Holmes stood up and began pacing the room. Moving while thinking was a necessity for him. His mind and body had to work simultaneously. "A suicide note, Watson, is a person's last words, a summary of their life, their pain, their decision. What do people write in these notes? They write names, they write events, they write apologies, accusations, explanations. Dear mother, forgive me. Tell John I always loved him. My boss ruined me. Concrete, personal, specific things." Holmes stopped and turned to Watson. "But what does this note say? I no longer have the strength to go on." "Who is it addressed to?" "No one." "Why is he committing suicide?" "It's unclear." "Who is he blaming?" "No one." "This note, Watson, is not a suicide note. This note is the general definition of a suicide note, a template." Watson's eyes widened. "So someone could have written this note?" "Exactly," said Holmes. "This note was written to make it look like suicide, a psychological lock to prevent the police from asking questions. The moment they say, 'There's a suicide note,' what does the police do? They close the case, because suicide is a final point. It requires an explanation, but it doesn't require an investigation." Watson stood up and came over to Holmes. "So you think this man was murdered?" Holmes paused for a moment. "I don't know yet. he said finally. "But I know this. Something is wrong with this case, and pursuing what's wrong is my job." Half an hour later, Holmes and Watson left Baker Street and got into a carriage. Their destination was Scotland Yard. Holmes wanted official permission to investigate this case, or at least access to the information gathered by the police. As the carriage rolled through the streets of London, Holmes was silent. Watson tried to read his thoughts, but couldn't. Despite their years of friendship, Holmes' mind remained a mystery. Watson could only see the surface ripples, not the currents beneath. When they arrived at Scotland Yard, Holmes headed straight for Inspector Lestrade's office. Lestrade was both surprised and slightly uneasy to see Holmes. The two had worked together on many cases over the years. Lestrade respected Holmes's intellect, but also feared his criticism. "Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, rising to his feet, "to see you unexpected." "Inspector," said Holmes, cutting the greeting short, "I wish to inquire about yesterday's train case. Daniel Moore." Lestrade's eyebrows furrowed. "The Moore case? It's a simple suicide, Mr. Holmes. The file is almost closed." "That's precisely why I'm here," said Holmes. "I want answers to a few questions before it's closed." Lestrade hesitated for a moment, then sighed and picked up the file from his desk. "What do you want to know?" Holmes took the file and quickly scanned it. The autopsy report, witness statements, crime scene notes. He read and absorbed it all in a few minutes. "Interesting," said Holmes, returning the file. "The autopsy says sudden cardiac arrest. No signs of poisoning." "Correct," said Lestrade. "The toxicology report came back clean. The man died of a heart attack." "What about the suicide note?" Lestrade shrugged. "It was found in his pocket. The handwriting hasn't been verified yet, but there is a suicide note, Mr. Holmes. The man may have been suicidal and may have had a heart attack. Both are possible." Holmes shook his head. "Or both could be wrong." Lestrade narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "Just a hunch for now, Inspector. But I want to investigate this case, unofficially. Just ask a few questions, look around a few places." Lestrade thought about it. He knew of Holmes's past, successes. Holmes had solved many cases Scotland Yard couldn't crack, and if something was truly wrong in this case, finding it early would benefit everyone. "All right," Lestrade finally said, "but be careful and share everything you find with me." Holmes smiled slightly. "Always, Inspector. Always." When they left Scotland Yard, Holmes's next stop was clear. Victoria Terminal. He wanted to see the scene of the crime. He took Watson with him, and the two headed for the train station. The station was crowded even in the middle of the day. Passengers were rushing about, vendors were shouting, trains were changing platforms. Holmes moved calmly through the chaos, his eyes scanning every detail. When they reached the platform where the commuter train stopped, Holmes headed for the station attendant's booth. Inside, an old man was reading a newspaper. Holmes knocked on the door. "Harold Finch?" Holmes asked. The man looked up. "Yes, that's me. Who are you?" "Sherlock Holmes. I have a few questions about yesterday's incident." Finch's eyes widened. He had heard of Sherlock Holmes. Who in London hadn't? He immediately stood up and adopted a respectful demeanour. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. How can I assist you?" Holmes explained the case to Finch and asked him to confirm it. Finch repeated what he had told the police yesterday, that he had found Moore, that the man was cold, that he took the same train every day. "You said the same seat every day," said Holmes. "Is that certain?" Absolutely, Mr. Holmes. He's been doing it for years. Middle compartment, window seat, on the right side facing the direction of travel. The man acted as if it belonged to him. Even if someone else was sitting there, he would get up at the next stop and take his place. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Have you noticed anything unusual in the past few weeks? A new passenger? Strange behavior? Finch thought for a moment. Well, actually, yes. For the past few weeks, a man has been boarding the train, but he never gets off. Holmes's eyes lit up. What do you mean? Well, the man gets on the train, but he doesn't go all the way to the last stop. He gets off at a stop along the way. But here's the strange part. Every time, he gets on a different car. It's as if he's looking for something or following someone. Can you describe this man? Finch shook his head. Middle-aged, maybe in his 50s. Slender build, wears a dark coat. I couldn't see his face clearly. He always pulled his hat down. Holmes gave Watson a meaningful look. This was new information. It wasn't in the police report. One more thing, said Finch, his voice lowering slightly. Last night, before the train was pulled into the depot, I noticed something. I don't usually work the night shift, but last night I was helping a friend. Around midnight, someone entered the depot. Holmes's full attention was on Finch. Who? I don't know. I only saw a shadow. It went over to the train, stayed there for a few minutes, then disappeared. I wanted to go and look, but to be honest, I was scared. Then the events of the morning happened, and I forgot about it. Holmes remained silent for a long time. Then he thanked Finch and left the platform with Watson. What do you think? Watson asked as they exited the station. Holmes didn't answer. His mind was processing the new information. A shadow entering the depot at midnight. A man watching the train for the past few weeks. A victim sitting in the same seat every day. And a man found dead with a fake suicide note in his pocket. I'm thinking, Watson, Holmes finally said, that in this case, everything is not as it seems. And to find the answer, I'll need to look very closely at that seat. That night, Holmes sat thinking for hours at 221B Baker Street. Watson had long since gone to bed, but Holmes couldn't sleep. He sat in front of the fireplace, puffing on his pipe, staring at the ceiling. An image was forming in his mind. It was still incomplete, blurry, but some shapes were beginning to take form. A man, following the same routine for years. The same train every morning, the same seat. This routine made him predictable, vulnerable, and someone noticed this vulnerability. The shadow entering the depot at midnight. The mysterious man watching the train. The fake note placed in his pocket. All of it pointed to a plan. A cold, calculated long-term plan. Who? Holmes murmured into the darkness. Who could be so patient, so meticulous, so vengeful? There was no answer yet. But Holmes knew the answer was there, somewhere, hidden in Daniel Moore's past. His relationships, his mistakes. And Holmes would find it, because a murder had been committed. A perfect murder. And perfect murders were Sherlock Holmes's specialty. Chapter 3. The Compartment. The next morning, Holmes and Watson set out early. Their goal was to examine the train on which Daniel Moore had made his final journey, and especially the compartment where he was found dead. Holmes had spent the night thinking and developing some theories, but theories without evidence were merely speculation. And Sherlock Holmes was not a man who was satisfied with speculation. Victoria Terminal was bustling even in the early hours of the morning. Steam locomotives waited on the platforms. Passengers boarded and disembarked from carriages, and attendants blew whistles and gave instructions. Holmes and Watson made their way through the crowd towards the train depot. Holmes gained entry to the depot by showing the permit he had obtained from Lestrade the previous day. The depot was a large area at the back of the station, enclosed by big metal doors. Inside, dozens of carriages were lined up, some being repaired, some being cleaned, and some waiting for their next trip. Holmes approached an attendant and asked about the train where Moore had been found dead. The attendant directed them to a carriage in a far corner of the depot. The car had been kept separate from the others. There was a police seal on the door, but Lestrade had given them permission to break it. Holmes carefully removed the seal and opened the car door. When they entered, Watson felt a slight shiver. A man had died here a few days ago. Quietly, unnoticed, as if he had fallen asleep. Watson, as a man with medical training, could keep his distance from death, but he still felt a strange unease in such places. Holmes, however, was completely different. His eyes scanned every inch of the carriage, the seats, the windows, the floor, the ceiling. No detail escaped him. Watson had seen his friend in this state of intense concentration many times before. When Holmes was on a trail, the rest of the world ceased to exist for him. When they reached the middle compartment, Holmes stopped. This was where Daniel Moore had breathed his last. The seat by the window, on the right side facing the direction of travel, was exactly as Harold Finch had described it. Holmes knelt in front of the seat and began his examination. First, he assessed its overall appearance. The seat looked no different from the others. Same fabric, same colour, same design. But Holmes knew very well that appearances could be deceiving. He ran his fingers over the surface of the chair. The fabric bore the marks of years of use. Slight wear, faded colours, old stains. But these were not what Holmes was looking for. He was searching for something new. A change, an intervention, a trace. And he found it. At the point where the armrest met the back of the chair, there was a very faint scratch. Barely visible to the eye, barely perceptible to the touch. But it was there. A fresh scratch, as if made just a few days ago. Holmes took out his magnifying glass and examined the scratch. It was fine, even, deliberate. It couldn't have been caused by natural wear and tear or a random bump. Someone had done something here. "Watson," Holmes said, lowering his voice. "Come and take a look at this." Watson approached and looked where Holmes was pointing. At first, he saw nothing. The scratch was so fine that it was almost invisible in normal light. But when Holmes held up the magnifying glass, the scratch became distinct. "What is this?" Watson asked. "A mark of interference," said Holmes. "Someone had placed something on this chair, or placed it and then removed it, or—" Holmes paused and thought. "Or placed it, and it's still there." Watson's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he began to examine the armrest of the chair more closely. He ran his fingers over the joint, pressed, probed, and then he heard a faint clicking sound. Holmes froze. Watson had heard it too. They both looked at each other. "There's something there," Watson said, his voice reduced to a whisper. Holmes nodded. "Yes. And I need to find out what it is." He stood up and began to think. "But doing that here under these conditions is risky. If there really is a mechanism there, one wrong move could trigger it or destroy the evidence. What will you do?" "I'll have to convince Lestrade," said Holmes. "This seat needs to be removed and examined by an expert. But first, I need more evidence. The police won't remove a seat just because of a scratch. Holmes continued his examination. He looked at other parts of the carriage, checked the floors, examined the windows, but he found no other obvious clues. The murder, if it was indeed a murder, had been carried out with surgical precision. When they left the depot, Holmes' next target was to find witnesses. The police report contained statements from several passengers. One of them, Walter Price, said he had seen a man looking angrily at Moore. Holmes wanted to find this man. Walter Price's address was available in police records. He lived in a small terraced house in a middle-class neighborhood in Kensington. Holmes and Watson went to this address in the afternoon. The man who opened the door was in his 40s, of medium height, with a serious face. When Holmes introduced himself, Price's eyes widened in surprise. "Sherlock Holmes?" said Price. "The real Sherlock Holmes?" "The man himself," said Holmes. "I have a few questions for you, Mr. Price, regarding the Daniel Moore case." Price let them in and led them to the living room. It was a small but clean house. The furniture was simple, the walls bare, everything tidy. The home of a bachelor or a well-organized family. "How can I assist you?" asked Price, sitting across from them. "In your statement to the police," said Holmes, "you mentioned that during the journey a man had glared angrily at Moore. Could you describe this man?" Price thought. He was a middle-aged man, in his 40s, maybe a little older. He was wearing a dark suit, had a hat. His face, it was a stern face. Not angry, actually, more cold. Yes, he had a cold look. How was he looking at Moore? "Well," said Price, clasping his hands together. "When I got on the compartment, Moore was already sitting there, by the window, his usual spot. I didn't know him then. I found out who he was later. Anyway, a few minutes later, this man got on. He entered the compartment, stopped as he passed Moore, and looked at him. A long look, a few seconds. Then he walked on and sat down somewhere else. What happened next? He turned around and looked back a few times during the journey. Each time he was looking at Moore. Moore didn't seem to notice, or perhaps chose not to. But I noticed. It felt strange." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Did this man get off the train?" "Yes, he got off at the stop before the last one, at Clapham Junction." "Did he approach Moore? Did he speak to him?" "No," said Price. "He just looked. But that look, it was unsettling, as if he knew the man, as if he wanted to say something to him, but couldn't." Holmes stood up and walked to the window. Outside, London was covered in grey clouds. The pieces were beginning to fit together in his mind. "Mr. Price," said Holmes, turning, "if you saw this man again, would you recognize him?" Price thought for a moment. "Yes, I think I would. His face has stayed with me." "Thank you, Mr. Price. You've been very helpful." As they left Price's house, Watson asked curiously, "Could this man be the killer?" Holmes shook his head. "A suspect, yes. The killer? We don't know yet. The fact that he looked angry at Moore doesn't mean he killed him. But I need to find the connection between them." "What will you do?" "I'll find this man," said Holmes. "Thomas Garrett. His name appears in the police report. Lestrade's team questioned him but didn't get a satisfactory result. I want to talk to him myself." Thomas Garrett's address was also in the police records. He lived in Suffolk, on the south bank of the river near the commercial district. Holmes and Watson went to this address in the evening. Garrett's home was on the top floor of a 3-story commercial building. The lower floors were used as storage, while the top floor was arranged as living quarters. When Holmes knocked on the door, heavy footsteps sounded from inside, and the door opened. Thomas Garrett was a man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and stern-faced. His brows were furrowed, his lips pressed together, his whole demeanour defensive. He eyed Holmes and Watson. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Sherlock Holmes," Holmes said calmly. "I'd like to ask a few questions about the Daniel Moore case." Garrett's face changed, first surprise, then unease, then a kind of weariness. His shoulders slumped, and he opened the door wide. "Come in," he said, "but it won't take long. I've already told the police everything." When they entered, Watson surveyed the room. It was messy, papers on the desk, boxes on the floor, maps on the walls. Garrett was clearly a merchant, but a disorganized one. "Mr. Garrett," said Holmes, sitting down across from him, "according to your statement to the police, you and Daniel Moore had an argument before boarding the train. Is that correct?" Garrett sighed. "Argument is a big word. Just a little disagreement, that's all." "About what?" "The man bumped into me," Garrett said, raising his voice. "At the station in the crowd, he bumped into me with his shoulder. I stumbled, spilled my coffee, stained my coat. And you know what the man did? Nothing. He didn't even turn around. He didn't apologize. He acted as if I wasn't even there. And that made you angry." "Of course it did." Garrett stood up and began pacing the room. "I'm walking like a normal person, and he comes along and bumps into me, doesn't even apologize. What kind of person acts like that?" Holmes watched him calmly. "And then?" "Then we got on the same train. Coincidence. I got angry. When I saw him, yes. I looked at him a few times. Maybe I looked angry, I don't know. But I didn't touch him. I didn't speak. I just looked." "Did you know him before the train?" "No," Garrett said firmly. "I saw him for the first time that day. And the last." Holmes remained silent for a moment. He was analysing Garrett's face, posture, and voice. He was trying to figure out if he was lying. "Mr. Garrett," he finally said, "what do you do for a living?" Garrett looked surprised. "Merchant, textiles. I buy and sell fabric." "Have you ever worked in the logistics sector?" "No. Why do you ask?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and turned to Watson. "We can go." Garrett looked stunned. "That's it?" "For now," said Holmes. "But I have one more question. Has anyone threatened you for your testimony? Or has anyone approached you asking questions?" Garrett thought. "No, just the police, and now you." Holmes nodded and headed for the door. Watson followed. When they stepped outside, Watson asked, "What do you think?" Holmes walked for a long time before answering. When they reached the riverbank, he stopped and looked at the water. The Thames flowed dark and slow in the dim evening light. "Garrett is innocent," Holmes finally said. Watson was surprised. "How can you be so sure?" "Because he has nothing," Holmes said. "No connection to Moore, no involvement in the logistics sector. Just someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. A minor argument, a few angry glances, that's all." "But someone was giving Moore an angry look." "Yes," said Holmes. "And that angry look was probably used to distract the police. Or it was just a coincidence. But Garrett isn't the killer." "Then who?" Holmes turned and looked at Watson. There was a dark gleam in his eyes. "We were looking at the wrong man, Watson," he said. "The murder didn't start on the train. It began years ago. And to find the answer, I'll have to delve into Daniel Moore's past." Holmes started walking. Watson followed behind. As London surrendered to the night, both knew this case would lead them to a place far deeper and darker than it appeared. and the name of that place was hidden in the shadow of an unknown vengeance. Chapter 4. The Wrong Man. The next morning, the breakfast table at 221B Baker Street was set earlier than usual. Mrs. Hudson was surprised to see Holmes up so early. Normally, he worked late into the night and slept until noon. But this morning was different. Holmes had woken before dawn, dressed, and sat down at the table. When Watson came downstairs, he found his friend deep in thought. There was a stack of papers in front of Holmes, handwritten notes, drawn diagrams, names, and dates. He must have worked through the night. "Good morning," said Watson, sitting down at the table. "Did you sleep at all?" Holmes looked up. There were faint circles under his eyes, but his gaze was sharp and alert. "Sleep can wait, Watson. Murder cannot." Watson glanced at the papers in front of Holmes. "What did you find?" Holmes gathered the papers and organized them. "Last night I compiled all the information I have on Daniel Moore. Police reports, newspaper clippings, witness statements. And I noticed something. We know almost nothing about Moore." "What do you mean?" "Think about it, Watson. The man is 52 years old. He lives in London. He takes the same train every day. But where is his family? Who are his friends? What is his job? What is his past? The police report only says, former logistics company manager, reclusive in recent years. That's not a biography, that's a shadow." Watson frowned. Maybe the man was truly alone. "Alone, yes," said Holmes. "But why? People don't become lonely for no reason, Watson. Either they're running from something, hiding something, or something is making them lonely. Which applies to Moore." Holmes stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the streets of London were filling with the early morning crowd. Vendors were setting up their stalls. Workers were walking to factories. Children were running to school. A normal morning, normal people. But Holmes's mind was elsewhere. "Today," said Holmes, turning, "we will investigate Moore's past. Who he was, where he came from, who he worked with. The answers are there, Watson. I'm sure of it." Their first stop was Moore's old workplace. According to the police report, Moore had worked as a manager at a logistics company years ago. The company's name appeared in the records, Blackfriars Logistics. Holmes checked the trade registry to see if the company still existed. The records revealed an interesting picture. Blackfriars Logistics had been founded in 1873 by two partners, Daniel Moore and Marcus Hale. The company had operated successfully for 10 years, becoming one of London's largest logistics companies. But in 1883, the company had suddenly gone into liquidation. The records did not state the reason, only noting disagreement between the partners. Holmes relayed this information to Watson. Two partners worked together for 10 years. Then they suddenly split up. Moore became isolated, withdrawn. What happened to the other partner, Marcus Hale? Watson shrugged. Maybe he started another business, or retired. "Perhaps," said Holmes, "but I need to find out." When they went to Scotland Yard, Holmes asked Lestrade for information about Marcus Hale. Lestrade asked Holmes where he had come across the name. Holmes explained briefly. Lestrade agreed to check the records. Half an hour later, Lestrade returned with an interesting file. "Marcus Hale," said Lestrade, opening the file. "A case was filed in 1883, charges of forgery and fraud. Plaintiff, Daniel Moore." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Go on." "Moore accused his partner Hale of forging documents. Allegedly, Hale manipulated the company's accounts and defrauded customers. The case went to court, but was interestingly dismissed. Why? There wasn't enough evidence. Hale wasn't convicted, but Lestrade paused. He completely lost his reputation during the trial. Newspaper reports, rumors, social ostracism. Hale's family abandoned him. His business associates turned their backs on him. The man was socially destroyed. Holmes took a deep breath. He was punished without being convicted. It seems so, said Lestrade. But what does this have to do with Moore's death? Hale could have died 20 years ago for all we know. Holmes shook his head. No, Inspector. Hale didn't lose his life. At least not physically. But he lost everything else. And losses like that leave deep scars on people. Holmes stood up and walked to the window. His mind was working with the new information. 20 years ago, a partnership, a betrayal, a case. Moore's signature had destroyed Hale's life, and now Moore was dead. I need to find Marcus Hale, Holmes finally said. Finding Marcus Hale proved more difficult than Holmes had anticipated. The man had virtually disappeared after the 1883 lawsuit. His name did not appear in trade records. There was no trace of him in property records. He had no membership in social clubs. It was as if he had been erased from society. But Holmes did not give up. He combed through old newspaper archives, spoke to retired police officers, asked questions in old business circles, and finally, he found a clue. In 1885, Marcus Hale's name appeared in a newspaper article. The article reported that Hale's wife had filed for divorce and had been granted custody of their children. The article stated that Hale was impoverished and destitute. In 1890, Hale's name appeared again in another article. This time it was a charity story. Hale said he was staying at a poorhouse in the East End and making a living repairing watches. The reporter played on the theme of the fall of a once successful businessman. Holmes relayed this information to Watson. "Watch repair," he said thoughtfully. "Precise mechanical work. Small parts, fine adjustments, careful work." Watson furrowed his brow. "What's the significance of that?" Holmes didn't answer, but a spark flashed in his eyes. A theory was forming in his mind, unfinished but taking shape. That night, Holmes and Watson visited the poorhouse in the East End. Passing through dark, narrow streets, they arrived at a dimly lit building. An old man waiting at the door greeted them. "Sherlock Holmes," said Holmes, introducing himself. "I'm looking for Marcus Hale. I hear he stays here." The old man thought for a moment. "Hale? Yes, I know him. But he doesn't live here anymore. He left a few years ago." "Where did he go?" "I don't know for sure, but I heard he moved south of the river, around Clapham. He rented a room there." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Clapham?" "Yes, why?" Holmes didn't answer. He turned to Watson, a serious expression on his face. "Clapham Junction, the station before the last stop. According to Walter Price's statement, the man who looked angrily at Moore got off there." Watson's eyes widened. "Then it wasn't Garrett. Garrett is innocent." "Correct," said Holmes. "Garrett was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Our real target is someone else. And now we have a name. Marcus Hale." He turned to the old man. "What else do you know about Hale? What was he like?" The old man thought. "He was a quiet man, introverted. He never spoke to anyone. He spent his days tinkering with clocks. And at night. At night, he went out. No one knew where he went." "Did he go out often?" "Yes, in the last few years, especially in the early morning hours. He'd go out before dawn and return around noon, every day at the same time." Holmes nodded. The picture was becoming clear. Hale must have been watching Moore for years. He had learned his routines. Which train he took, which seat he sat in, where he was, and when. And finally, he had put his perfect plan into action. "Thank you," Holmes said to the old man. "You've been very helpful." By the time they returned to Baker Street, it was past midnight. Watson was exhausted, but Holmes looked energetic. The puzzle in his mind was taking shape, and it excited him. In the sitting room, Holmes reviewed all the information once more. He spread the papers on the table and turned to Watson. "So, what do we have?" said Holmes. Daniel Moore accused his partner Marcus Hale of forging documents 20 years ago. The case was dismissed, but Hale's life was ruined. His career, his family, his reputation, everything. The man ended up in a poorhouse, scraping by as a watchmaker. Watson shook his head. "But that doesn't mean Hale killed Moore." "By itself, no," said Holmes. "But consider this. Hale has been going out early every morning for the last few years. Moore takes the same train, the same seat, every morning. Hale lives near Clapham. Moore's train passes through Clapham Junction. And at the station before the last stop, the man who watches Moore gets off." Watson's eyes widened. Hale was watching Moore. "For years," said Holmes, his voice taking on a dark tone. "He learned his routines. He discovered his habits. And one day, when the opportunity arose, he acted." "But how?" Watson asked. "There were no wound marks on Moore, no signs of poisoning. The man appears to have died of a heart attack." Holmes smiled, but it wasn't a cheerful smile. It was a dark, thoughtful smile. "That's exactly it, Watson," he said. "The perfect murder. A murder that leaves no trace on the victim, no witnesses, no suspicion. But every perfect plan has a flaw, and Hale's flaw is hidden in that chair." Holmes walked to the window and looked out. London was shrouded in night. Street lamps cast dim lights. Shadows danced on the walls. "Tomorrow," said Holmes, "I'll have that chair dismantled, and I'll find out what's inside it." Watson stood up and came over to his friend. "Are you sure, Holmes? This is just a theory. Maybe you're wrong." Holmes turned and looked at Watson. There was absolute certainty in his eyes. "I'm not mistaken, Watson," he said. 20 years ago, Moore signed his name and destroyed a man's life. That man waited 20 years, patiently, meticulously, with hatred. And finally, he took his revenge. The murder didn't begin on the train. The murder began 20 years ago with that signature. Holmes turned back to the table and gathered the papers. "We were looking at the wrong man, Watson," he said. "Garrett is innocent, just a victim of coincidence. The real killer is someone hiding in the shadows. And his name is Marcus Hale." Watson remained silent for a long time. Then he took a deep breath. "So what do we do now?" Holmes smiled. "We'll sleep now. Tomorrow will be a long day, and finally, we'll uncover the truth." But Holmes didn't sleep that night. He sat in front of the fireplace, smoked his pipe, and thought. In his mind, a 20-year-old story of revenge was unfolding. Patience, pain, hatred, and finally, a cold reckoning. Marcus Hale had planned the perfect murder, but he hadn't accounted for one thing. Sherlock Holmes would look at objects, not people. And that object was a train seat. Chapter 5. The Shadow Man. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows of Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes was already awake. He hadn't slept all night. His mind had worked like an unstoppable machine, processing information, generating theories, making connections. When Watson came downstairs, he found his friend sitting at the table. In front of him was a stack of papers. Next to him, a cold cup of tea. "You haven't slept at all," Watson remarked. Holmes looked up. The circles under his eyes were more pronounced, but his gaze was sharper and more alert than ever. "Sleep is a luxury, Watson. We have no luxuries at the moment." Watson sat down at the table and looked at the papers in front of Holmes. Names, dates, addresses, drawn maps. Holmes had spent the night compiling a file on Marcus Hale. "What did you find?" Watson asked. Holmes organized the papers and pushed them toward Watson. "The story of Marcus Hale, or rather, the story of a man's downfall." Watson began to take the papers. As Holmes spoke, the story unfolded piece by piece. Marcus Hale was born in London in 1831. His family was middle-class merchants. His father was a watchmaker, his mother a housewife. Hale had learned watchmaking from his father and understood the intricacies of fine mechanical work. But young Hale had bigger dreams. Watch repair was merely a starting point for him, not the final destination. In his 20s, Hale entered the world of commerce. The logistics sector was growing rapidly at the time. Railways were becoming widespread, maritime trade was increasing, and the Industrial Revolution was gaining momentum. Hale saw this opportunity and seized it. In 1865, he met Daniel Moore. Moore and Hale were complementary partners. Moore was a man with strong social connections and high persuasive skills. Hale, on the other hand, was meticulous, thorough, and systematic. Together, they founded Blackfriars Logistics in 1873. The company grew rapidly, becoming one of London's largest logistics companies. For 10 years, the partnership ran smoothly, but in 1882, things changed. That year, an accounting scandal erupted at the firm. Several customers claimed their invoices had been inflated. An investigation was launched, and the documents were examined. And the documents bore Marcus Hale's signature. Holmes turned to Watson. "This is the critical point of the story. The documents bore Hale's signature, but Hale claimed he hadn't signed them. According to him, the signatures had been forged." Watson frowned. "Forged? By whom?" "According to Hale, by Moore." Holmes stood up and walked to the window. According to Hale's claim, Moore wanted to take over the company alone. He forged the documents to eliminate Hale and frame him. Could he prove it? "No," said Holmes. And that's where the tragedy began. Hale denied the accusations but couldn't provide any evidence. Moore went to court and formally charged his partner. The case attracted a lot of attention. The newspapers covered it for days. Hale's name became synonymous with fraud. Holmes turned and looked at Watson. The case was eventually dismissed. There wasn't enough evidence, but by that point, it was too late. Hale's reputation was ruined. Watson continued reading the notes Holmes had prepared. Hale's downfall was documented step by step. 1883. After the case was dismissed, Hale was ostracized from business circles. No one wanted to work with him. He was forced to sell his shares in the firm to Moore for a symbolic price. 1884. Hale's wife filed for divorce. The court awarded custody of the children to the mother. Hale lost his family. 1885. Hale sold his house in Mayfair and moved to the East End. He began living in a poorhouse. 1886 to 1890. Hale returned to watch repairing, a trade he had learned from his father. He worked in a small shop, barely scraping by. He became almost completely cut off from society. Watson put down the papers and looked at Holmes. This man has lost everything. His career, his family, his reputation, everything. And he believed he lost it all because of one man, said Holmes. Daniel Moore. Watson nodded thoughtfully. But that doesn't prove Hale is the killer. Maybe the man was just trying to rebuild his life. Holmes smiled, but there was no joy in that smile. Perhaps, Watson. But now let me tell you the rest of the story. Holmes shared the results of his research throughout the night. He had combed through old newspaper archives, spoken to retired police officers, and questioned acquaintances in the East End. And the picture that emerged was disturbing. After 1890, Marcus Hale's life had changed. He had left the poorhouse and moved to the Clapham area. He rented a small room and continued repairing watches. But he wasn't just repairing watches anymore. According to witnesses Holmes found, Hale had taken up a strange hobby in recent years, making mechanical devices. Small, complex, delicate mechanisms. Some looked like toys, while others could serve a more sinister purpose. One witness, said Holmes, said Hale was working on silent triggers, pressure-sensitive mechanisms, devices that activate after a certain weight or time. Watson's face paled. The manner of Moore's death? Exactly, said Holmes. Sudden cardiac arrest. No visible signs from the outside. But what if there was an invisible intervention? What if a device placed in the chair injected something after a certain period of time? Watson stood up and began pacing the room uneasily. That's horrific. If it's true, Hale spent years planning this. 20 years, Holmes said quietly. He waited 20 years. He planned his revenge. He watched Moore, learned his routines, discovered his weaknesses. And finally, he realized that a man's most vulnerable point is not himself, but his habits. That afternoon, Holmes and Watson went to Clapham. They wanted to find the address where Hale was said to live. The information was limited. They only had the clue Clapham area south of the river. But Holmes was accustomed to solving puzzles like this. Clapham was an area in South London where middle-class and working-class neighbourhoods intermingled. Narrow streets, terraced houses, small shops. Holmes and Watson visited every clock repair shop in the area. At the third shop, an elderly man answered Holmes's questions. "Marcus Hale?" the man said, narrowing his eyes. "Yes, I know him. He used to work around here, but he didn't have his own shop. He was a travelling repairman. He went to people's homes." Where did he live? The man thought. On Clapham Road in an old boarding house, but it burned down a few years ago. I don't know where Hale moved to. Holmes pressed further. "What do you know about Hale? What was he like?" The old man shrugged. "Quiet. Very quiet. He never talked to anyone. He just did his job, got paid, and left. But he was good at his work, I must say. He could fix even the smallest mechanism. Dexterous hands, sharp eyes." "Have you seen him lately?" the man thought. "I saw him a few weeks ago, I think. He was walking down the street early in the morning. It was strange, actually. The man usually went out during the day, but lately I'd always see him in the early hours of the morning." Holmes's eyes lit up. "The dead of night? How early?" "Before dawn, around 5 or 5:30. He usually walked toward the train station." Watson gave Holmes a meaningful look. Moore's train left at 6 in the morning. Hale was following Moore's train route. Holmes thanked the old man and they left the shop. As they walked down the street, Watson asked, "What are you thinking?" Holmes didn't answer for a long time. They walked, they thought, the noise of London buzzing around them. Finally, Holmes spoke. "I think, Watson, that Marcus Hale was Daniel Moore's shadow for 20 years. He watched him, followed him, recorded his every move. When Moore boarded the same train, every morning, Hale was somewhere nearby. When Moore sat in the same seat every day, Hale knew it." "But why did he wait 20 years? Holmes paused and turned to Watson. "Because revenge requires patience, Watson. Hale didn't just want to kill Moore. He wanted to kill him perfectly, without leaving a trace, without arousing suspicion, and most importantly, without getting caught." Watson shuddered. "That cold-bloodedness, it's inhuman." "No," said Holmes. "It's very human. Hatred, patience, revenge. The darkest sides of humanity." Hale stared into that darkness for 20 years, and the darkness stared back at him. That evening, when they returned to Baker Street, Holmes immediately got to work. He gathered all the information he had, created a timeline, mapped out the connections. 1873, Moore and Hale founded Blackfriars Logistics. 1882, the accounting scandal broke. Moore accused Hale. 1883, the case was dismissed, but Hale's life was ruined. 1884, Hale's wife divorced him and took custody of their children. 1885, Hale fell into poverty in the East End. 1886 to 1890, Hale returned to watchmaking. 1890, Hale moved to Clapham, near Moore's train route. 1890 to 1893, Hale began going out early in the morning. He followed Moore. November 1893, Moore was found dead in his train seat. Holmes looked at the timeline. A 20-year revenge story was summarized on a single page. "The only thing missing," Holmes said to himself, "is concrete evidence, physical proof that Hale killed Moore." Watson asked from the chair in front of the fireplace. "The seat?" Holmes nodded. "The chair. If my theory is correct, there's a device inside that chair. A mechanism Hale made, and that mechanism killed Moore. Will you be able to convince Lestrade tomorrow?" Holmes smiled. "It won't be difficult to convince Lestrade, Watson. I'll present him with a concrete suspect, a logical theory, and potential evidence. He'll take care of the rest." Watson stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the London night was dark and quiet. Street lamps cast dim light, shadows dancing on the walls. "Holmes," Watson said, his back turned. "If Hale really did this, if he planned it for 20 years, waited, watched, what kind of mind is that?" Holmes remained silent for a long time. Then he replied, his voice low and thoughtful. "A broken mind, Watson. But broken doesn't mean weak. Sometimes broken pieces are sharper than the whole. Hale broke when he lost everything, but he sharpened those broken pieces for 20 years. And in the end, he turned them into a perfect weapon." Watson turned and looked at Holmes. "And now we need to find that weapon." Holmes nodded. "Tomorrow, Watson. Tomorrow we'll dismantle that chair and we'll see what's inside." As the night wore on, both fell silent. Holmes was thinking. Watson was worrying. And somewhere in London, in the shadows, Marcus Hale might have known they were coming. Or perhaps he didn't. Perhaps he believed his 20-year plan was flawless. Perhaps he had never considered that Sherlock Holmes would focus on objects, not people. And this miscalculation would be his undoing. Chapter 6. The Device. Early in the morning, before London had awakened, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson set off for Scotland Yard. The sky was covered with leaden clouds. A gloomy English morning had settled over the city like a heavy blanket. The street lamps were still lit, their yellow light creating ghostly halos in the fog. The carriage creaked along the cobblestones. Holmes was silent throughout the journey. His eyes were fixed on the window, but Watson knew his friend wasn't really seeing outside. Holmes' mind was elsewhere, testing theories, weighing possibilities, developing strategies. Watson knew this state well. When Holmes was about to solve a case, the world ceased to exist for him. When they arrived at Scotland Yard, it was just past 7 o'clock. The building's corridors were quiet and empty. Only a few night watchmen were patrolling. Holmes headed straight for Inspector Lestrade's office. Lestrade might not be here at this hour, but Holmes would leave a message and wait. Surprisingly, Lestrade was in his office. He was sitting at his desk examining a file. He raised his eyebrows when he saw Holmes and Watson. "Mr. Holmes? At this hour?" Lestrade stood up, a look of fatigue and curiosity on his face. "Has something happened?" Holmes entered and closed the door. "Inspector, I have a theory to present to you. And if this theory is correct, the Daniel Moore case is not a suicide, but a murder." Lestrade's eyes widened. He hesitated for a moment, then sat back down and gestured to Holmes. "I'm listening." Holmes systematically recounted all the information he had gathered over the past few days. Marcus Hale's story, the partnership 20 years ago, the lawsuit, Hale's downfall, his watch repairing past, his move to Clapham, his early morning walks to the train station. He presented each piece of information in logical order, explained the connections, drew conclusions. Lestrade listened attentively. He occasionally asked questions and took notes. What Holmes was saying might have seemed speculative, but the logic behind it was sound. "Well," Lestrade finally said, putting down his pen, "let's say you're right. Let's say this Hale wanted to kill Moore, but how? The autopsy report is clean. No poisoning, no trauma, no signs of external intervention." Holmes smiled. He had been expecting this question. "That's precisely why I'm here, Inspector," said Holmes. "I want to dismantle the chair Moore was sitting in." Lestrade looked at him in astonishment. "The chair?" "Yes, the chair Moore sat in every day for years. My theory is that Hale planted a device in that chair, a pressure-sensitive, timed mechanism. When Moore sat down, the device activated and injected a fast-acting substance. The substance must be something that leaves no trace in the body and causes sudden cardiac arrest." Lestrade looked at him skeptically. This sounds like science fiction, Mr. Holmes." "It's not science fiction, Inspector. It's engineering. Hale was a watchmaker, remember? Precision mechanisms were his specialty. Small, complex, invisible devices. Think of the mechanisms that fit inside a wristwatch. Now apply that same precision to a more sinister purpose." Lestrade remained silent for a long time. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table, thought, debated. Finally, he took a deep breath. "All right," he said. "Let's dismantle the chair. But if nothing comes out of it, Mr. Holmes, I'm closing this case and not reopening it." Holmes nodded. Agreed. An hour later, Holmes, Watson and Lestrade arrived at the train depot of Victoria Terminal. They were accompanied by 2 police officers and Scotland Yard's technical expert. The technical expert was a man in his 60s, bespectacled and meticulous in appearance. His name was Harold Bennett, and he had been working for Scotland Yard for 30 years. The carriage where Moore had been found dead was still standing in the corner of the shed. The police seal was intact, dust and neglect settling on the carriage. Holmes carefully removed the seal and opened the carriage door. Holmes walked straight to the middle compartment. Moore's seat was there by the window, on the right side facing the direction of travel. "Mr. Bennett," Holmes said, turning to the technical expert, "I want to remove this seat, but we must be careful. If there is a mechanism inside, one wrong move could trigger it or destroy the evidence." Bennett nodded and opened his toolbox. He took out various screwdrivers, pliers, and magnifying glasses. He knelt in front of the seat and began to examine it. Holmes knelt beside him and took out his magnifying glass. The two men carefully examined every inch of the chair. The fabric, the wood, the metal parts, every stitch, every screw, every joint. "Here," Holmes said suddenly, his voice low but excited. "The point where the armrest meets the back. Do you see a scratch?" Bennett looked through the magnifying glass. "Yes, I see it. A fresh scratch. No more than a few days, maybe a week old." "This scratch indicates that something was placed there," said Holmes. "Now, we need to open this section very carefully." Bennett began working with a small screwdriver. He removed the screws one by one, separating the wooden pieces. Holmes watched every movement carefully, occasionally giving instructions. Watson and Lestrade stood back, holding their breath as they watched. 15 minutes passed. 20 minutes. Bennett was drenched in sweat, his hands trembling, but he kept working. And finally, he reached the inner surface of the armrest. "My God," Bennett said, his voice reduced to a whisper. "There's something here." Holmes leaned forward. He looked at the spot Bennett was pointing to, and what he saw confirmed his theory. On the inner surface of the armrest, embedded in the wood, was a small metal mechanism. The mechanism was smaller than a pocket watch. Intricate gears, thin springs, a small cylinder. And at the end of the entier cylinder, a metal tip as thin as a needle. "What is this?" Lestrade asked, stepping forward. Holmes stood up, a serious expression on his face. "This, Inspector, is a murder weapon, a micro-injection device, a pressure-sensitive trigger, a timed mechanism, and a cylinder that probably contained a fast-acting substance." Bennett examined the device carefully. "Incredible craftsmanship," he said, his voice filled with both admiration and horror. "To fit such a complex mechanism into such a small space, it requires extraordinary precision." "A watchmaker's precision," said Holmes. "Marcus Hale's signature." Lestrade looked at the device. His face had gone pale. Is this really murder? Could this little thing kill a man?" Holmes nodded. "The mechanism must have worked like this. When Moore sat down, his weight activated the sensitive trigger, but the mechanism didn't work immediately. There was a timer. After a certain amount of time, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, the mechanism was activated. The needle pierced through the chair's fabric and lodged itself into Moore's arm or back. The injection was so small and quick that Moore probably only felt a slight prick, perhaps like a mosquito bite, and, within a few minutes, the substance took effect. "Sudden cardiac arrest," said Watson, his voice hoarse. "Yes," said Holmes. "The autopsy found no visible external mark because the injection site was as small as a needle prick." And the substance was something that left no trace in the body. Perhaps potassium chloride in high doses, perhaps something else. Toxicology tests couldn't detect it because they didn't know what they were looking for. Lestrade took a deep breath. So Moore was killed in his seat without even realizing it. Exactly, said Holmes, and the killer probably wasn't even on the train at the time. He must have set up the device the night before. The shadow Harold Finch saw, the person who entered the warehouse at midnight, was most likely Marcus Hale. Bennett carefully removed the device and placed it in an evidence box. Holmes wanted to examine the device more closely. Bennett handed him the box. Holmes examined every part of the device with his magnifying glass. Gears, springs, screws. Each one was handmade, not mass-produced. There were no brands or markings on them, but Holmes could see the quality of the workmanship. It must have taken months to make this device, said Holmes. Perhaps years. Each part was specially designed and manufactured. Hale didn't just wait 20 years for this murder. He also created the perfect weapon. Watson looked at the device. He felt sick to his stomach. All that effort, all that time, all that patience, just to kill one man. Revenge, Watson, said Holmes, his voice low. Revenge drives people to do things no other motive could. Hale nurtured this revenge for 20 years. Every day when he woke up, he remembered how Moore had ruined him. Every night when he went to bed, he thought about what he had lost. His career, his family, his reputation, everything. And those thoughts slowly shaped him. They turned him from a broken man into a cold-blooded killer. Lestrade was taking notes in his notebook. So, what do we do now? We need to arrest Hale. Yes, said Holmes. But first, I want to check one more thing. Holmes pulled a small piece of paper from his coat pocket. Watson recognized it. It was a copy of the suicide note found in Moore's pocket. This note, said Holmes, was used to make it look like a suicide, but it contains a mistake. Lestrade looked curiously. What mistake? Holmes unfolded the note and read it. I no longer have the strength to go on. Everything has become too much. Don't blame anyone. It's a general, impersonal, formulaic text. But that's not the real problem. Holmes handed the note to Lestrade. Look at the paper, Inspector. Its quality, texture, colour. Lestrade took the note and examined it. It looks like standard writing paper. A bit yellowed, perhaps old. Exactly, said Holmes. Now I'll ask you a question. What kind of paper did you find at Moore's house? Lestrade thought. It's in the file, a few envelopes, some notes, newspaper clippings. And what was the paper quality of the envelopes and notes? Lestrade was beginning to understand. Was it different? Holmes nodded. I had the papers from Moore's house examined. They were all the same type. Thick, cream-coloured, high-quality paper. Probably bought in bulk from a stationery store. But this note... Holmes pointed to the note. This note was written on different paper. Thinner, whiter, cheaper paper. Watson narrowed his eyes. So the note wasn't written by Moore. Impossible, said Holmes. If a person is going to write a suicide note, they use the paper they have at home. They don't go out of their way to find different paper. This note was written by someone else, somewhere else, and placed in Moore's pocket. Lestrade examined the note again. The handwriting? Probably forged, said Holmes. Hale had been watching Moore for 20 years. Finding samples of his handwriting, studying them, forging them wouldn't be difficult. Maybe letters, maybe old documents. Hale had thought of everything. Lestrade closed the file and stood up. A determined expression was on his face. "Enough," he said. "We have enough evidence to arrest Marcus Hale. The device, the paper analysis, the past connection. The judge will issue a search warrant." Holmes shook his head. "One more thing, Inspector. Finding Hale might not be easy. The man has lived in the shadows for 20 years. He knows how to hide, how to become invisible." "We'll find him," said Lestrade. "London isn't that big." Holmes smiled, but there was doubt in that smile. "I hope you're right, Inspector. I hope you're right." That afternoon, Scotland Yard sprang into action. Lestrade assembled a team and began searching the Clapham area. Holmes and Watson joined the ARD search. Holmes's knowledge might help narrow down Hale's possible locations. They searched the narrow streets of Clapham, the old boarding houses, the small shops. Hale's acquaintances were questioned, his former neighbours located. But Hale himself was nowhere to be found. In the evening, Holmes picked up a clue. The owner of an old boarding house on Clapham Road said Hale had left there a few weeks earlier. He didn't know his new address, but he had heard Hale had moved to somewhere near the river. Holmes evaluated this information, near the river, in the Clapham area. This could be Battersea or Wandsworth. The search area expanded. Around midnight, Hale's trail was found at a boarding house in Wandsworth. The boarding house owner said Hale had arrived a few days earlier and rented a room upstairs. But Hale was not in his room that night. Holmes examined Hale's room. It was small and simple: a bed, a table, a chair. On the table were several tools: screwdrivers, pliers, magnifying, glasses, a watchmaker's tools. But there was something else. In the desk drawer, a stack of papers. Holmes examined the papers and his eyes widened. The papers were newspaper clippings, all about Daniel Moore. The 1883 trial, news stories from subsequent years, photos of Moore. Hale had followed Moore for 20 years and collected every article. "Obsession," said Holmes, showing the papers to Watson. "This isn't just revenge, Watson. This is an obsession." Hale thought about Moore, watched him, followed him for 20 years. Moore became his whole world, and in the end, he destroyed that world. Watson looked at the clippings. Some were yellowed and worn. They bore the marks of the years. "This man is sick," said Watson, "mentally sick." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "but the court will decide that. Our job is to find him." The next morning, Hale was still missing. Holmes was worried that Hale might have escaped. The man had lived in the shadows for 20 years. He knew how to hide. How to disappear. But Holmes didn't give up. He analysed Hale's psychology, tried to predict his possible behaviour. And he developed a theory. Hale didn't run away, Holmes said to Watson in the sitting room on Baker Street. He couldn't have. Watson looked at him in astonishment. "Why?" "Because his work isn't done yet," said Holmes. "Hale lived for this moment for 20 years. He wanted to see, know, feel Moore's death. And now Moore is dead, but Hale isn't satisfied, because no one knows." Watson began to understand. No one knows that Hale killed Moore. "Exactly," said Holmes. "It was recorded as a suicide. Hale's perfect plan, his perfect revenge, is unknown to anyone, and that bothers him." Holmes stood up and walked to the window. Outside, London was beginning to glow with the early morning light. "Hale wants to be known," said Holmes. "He wants someone to see what he did, to understand it. He wants his 20-year plan, his perfect murder, to be appreciated. And the only person who can make that happen. Watson narrowed his eyes. You. Holmes turned and looked at Watson. There was a dark gleam in his eyes. Me, he said. Sherlock Holmes. Hale knows I'm looking for him. And he'll come. He'll come to us. Because he wants to tell his story. Watson looked worried. This is dangerous, Holmes. The man is a killer. I know, said Holmes. But this is our only chance. To catch Hale, we must wait for him to come. And they waited. Morning turned to noon, noon to evening. Silence reigned on Baker Street. Holmes was thinking. Watson was worrying. And somewhere in London, Marcus Hale was making his decision. As midnight approached, the doorbell rang. Chapter 7. The Confession. When the door knocked, the clock at 221B Baker Street read 15 minutes past midnight. The fire in the fireplace was nearly out, and a dim light filled the room. Sherlock Holmes sat in his chair, his fingers joined in a tent shape, thinking. Dr. Watson waited in the opposite chair, half asleep. Both were waiting for this moment, Holmes with certainty, Watson with apprehension. The door knocked again, 3 times, slowly and deliberately. Holmes lifted his head and looked at Watson. There was a familiar gleam in his eyes, the look of a hunter who has spotted his prey. "He's here," said Holmes, his voice low and calm. Watson stood up, his hand instinctively going to his coat pocket. There was a gun there. Holmes had insisted he carry it tonight. "We must be careful," said Watson. "The man is dangerous." Holmes shook his head, but did not move. "Let's not wake Mrs. Hudson. I'll open the door." Holmes stood up and walked toward the stairs. Watson followed, behind a few steps back. They descended the stairs quietly, carefully. They stopped at the front door on the ground floor. Holmes opened the door. The man standing before him matched the description. Middle-aged, in his mid-50s, thin. He wore a dark coat and a black hat. His face was pale and tired, deep circles under his eye, hollows in his cheeks. But his eyes were alive. Dark, intense, fiery eyes. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, his voice hoarse but calm. "You were expecting me, weren't you?" Holmes stepped back and opened the door wide. "Mr. Hale, come in." Marcus Hale hesitated for a moment. His eyes scanned Holmes, then Watson behind him. He must have seen the gun, but he didn't care. He slowly entered, and Holmes closed the door. The 3 men climbed the stairs. When they entered the sitting room, Hale looked around. His eyes scanned the room. Books, maps, chemistry equipment, a violin. Sherlock Holmes's world. "The famous Baker Street," said Hale with a slight smile. "I've read about this address in the newspapers for years. Sherlock Holmes's place, the genius detective's headquarters." Holmes gestured to the chair in front of the fireplace. "Sit down, Mr. Hale. We have much to discuss." Hale slowly sat down in the chair. Holmes stood opposite him, Watson a little behind, standing. The room was silent. Only the crackling of the fireplace and the howling of the wind outside could be heard. "Why did you come?" Holmes asked directly. Hale looked at Holmes. There was a strange gleam in his eyes, fatigue, pain, and a kind of relief. "Because it's not over," Hale said. "Because I waited 20 years, planned, prepared, and finally I did it. But no one knows, no one understands. Moore's death was a small story in the papers. Suicide on the train. That's all, 20 years of work, summed up in a paragraph." Holmes shook his head. "And that bothered you?" "Disturbed?" Hale's voice rose, then fell again. "No, Mr. Holmes. It destroyed me. For 20 years. I lived for one thing, Daniel Moore's death. And now he's dead, but I feel nothing, no satisfaction, no peace, just emptiness. Watson watched Hale's face. The man truly looked broken, not physically, but spiritually. 20 years of vengeance had consumed him from within, leaving only a shell. "Then," said Holmes, "tell your story, from beginning to end." Hale took a deep breath. He closed his eyes, remained silent for a moment. Then he began to speak. "I met Daniel Moore in 1865, said Hale, his voice fading into the distance. "We were both young then, ambitious, with dreams. I was the son of a watchmaker. He came from a family of merchants. We were from different worlds, but we had one thing in common: the drive for success." Hale opened his eyes and looked at the fireplace. The flames had almost died out, leaving only embers. "We worked together for 8 years. We founded Blackfriars Logistics and built it up. I managed operations. She handled customer relations. It was a perfect partnership. Or so I thought." "What happened in 1882? Holmes asked. Hale's face darkened. "More happened. That year, an accounting scandal broke out at the firm. Customers claimed they had been defrauded, and the documents bore my signature." "You didn't sign them?" "No." Hale's voice rose, his eyes flashing. "I never even saw those documents, but the signatures looked like mine. Very similar, because Moore had seen my signature for years, on contracts, letters, reports. It wasn't hard to forge." Holmes shook his head. "Moore accused you?" "Accused me, yes. He went to court, spoke to the press, told everyone. My partner deceived me. I'm an innocent victim." And everyone believed him, because Moore was persuasive, charismatic. Me, on the other hand, I was just the watchmaker's son. Hale looked at his hands. They were long, slender fingers, hands made for delicate work. "The case was dismissed," Hale continued. "There wasn't enough evidence, but by then it was too late. My reputation was ruined. Business circles turned their backs on me. Banks wouldn't give me credit. Customers fled." "And your family?" A bitter smile appeared on Hale's face. "My wife filed for divorce in 1884. I can't stay married to a swindler," she said. "She took my children and moved to another city. I never saw them again." Watson felt something inside him snap. Hale had done a terrible thing, but his story was tragic. The collapse of a man, piece by piece, was unfolding before his eyes. "I ended up in a poorhouse," Hale said, his voice growing monotonous. "I returned to my father's trade, watch repair, small jobs, small pay, enough to survive, but not for anything more." "And more?" asked Holmes. "More?" Hale's eyes flashed with a dark fire. "Moore took over the company single-handedly. He grew it, became rich, became respected. He built an empire on the ruins of my life. And every day, while I was struggling in poverty, he lived in luxury." Hale stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the London night was dark and silent. "In the early years," Hale said, her back turned, "I was just trying to survive. The pain was too fresh, too intense. I couldn't think, couldn't plan. I was just breathing. But as the years passed, something changed." "What changed?" Hale turned and looked at Holmes. There was a cold, calculating expression in his eyes. The pain turned to anger. The anger turned to hatred. The hatred turned to a plan. Slowly, step by step, an idea took shape in my mind. Moore had destroyed me. I would destroy him. But simply killing him wasn't enough. It had to be perfect. There could be no trace. And most importantly, Moore must not know before he died. Shouldn't he know? Watson interrupted, astonished. Hale turned to Watson. Yes, Doctor. Moore shouldn't have known why he died, because that's the sweetest part of revenge, the victim dying without knowing who killed them or why. When Moore boarded the train that morning, he thought it was just another ordinary day. As usual, in his usual seat, on his usual journey. And then, nothing. Darkness. The end. Holmes watched Hale closely. How did you develop your plan? Hale sat back in his seat. He placed his hands on his knees and took a deep breath. It took years, he said. First, I started watching Moore. In 1890, I moved to Clapham. It was close to Moore's train route. I would get up early every morning and go to the station. I learned which train Moore took, which car he boarded, which seat he sat in. The same seat every day, said Holmes. The same seat every day, Hale repeated, nodding his head. Moore was a man of routine, a slave to his habits, and those habits were his undoing. Hale looked at his hands. He moved his fingers, as if adjusting an invisible mechanism. It took years to design the mechanism, he said. I used everything I learned from my father. Clock mechanisms, precision gears, microsprings. But this was different. This wasn't just a mechanism that measured time. This was a mechanism that activated when the time came. A pressure-sensitive trigger, said Holmes. Hale nodded, a look of admiration in his eyes. You really understand, Mr. Holmes. Yes, pressure-sensitive. When Moore sat down in the chair, his weight activated the trigger. But not immediately. There was a timer. 10 minutes. So Moore could relax, unwind, let his guard down. And then? Then, Hale said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The mechanism activated. A small needle pierced the fabric of the chair. It lodged in Moore's back. Very small, very fast. He probably only felt a slight prick, like a mosquito bite. What was inside it? Hale smiled, a dark smile. Potassium chloride, a high dose, directly into the bloodstream. The heart stops within minutes, and the best part? It leaves no trace in the body. The autopsy will say natural cardiac arrest. Because technically, the heart really did stop. Watson felt his stomach churn. This man had planned every detail of killing a person. Calmly, meticulously, over years. The suicide note, said Holmes. You wrote that too. Hale nodded. Of course, I studied Moore's handwriting for years. Old documents, letters, contracts. It wasn't difficult to imitate. The note was to prevent the police from asking questions. When they see a suicide note, people stop asking questions. They say, the man was suicidal, and move on. A flawless plan, said Holmes, his voice holding neither admiration nor condemnation. Just an observation. Perfect, Hale repeated. Or so I thought, but I didn't account for one thing. What? Hale looked at Holmes. There was weariness and a kind of acceptance in his eyes. You, Mr. Holmes, I didn't account for Sherlock Holmes. You read a small sentence in the newspaper. The man was found in the chair he used every day. And that sentence told you everything. Holmes smiled slightly. Not everything, but enough. How did you figure it out? Hale asked, genuinely curious. How did you deduce all this from a single sentence? Holmes leaned back in his chair in front of the fireplace. He pressed his fingers together in a tent shape and rested them on his lips. A person sits in the same chair every day, said Holmes, but only dies once. That difference is no coincidence. Wouldn't someone who commits suicide break their routine, Wouldn't they go somewhere different? No. Moore was the victim of his own habit, and that told me something was wrong. Then I looked at the suicide note. It was generic, impersonal, like a template. Real suicide notes aren't like that. There are names, events, emotions. This note was a caricature of a suicide note. Hale shook his head, a bitter smile on his face. I didn't make it personal enough. No. And then I looked into Moore's past. A partnership, a lawsuit, a collapse. You came into the picture, Mr. Hale. The partner from 20 years ago. The man who lost everything. And a watchmaker. An expert in delicate mechanisms. Holmes stood up and stood directly in front of Hale. You planned a perfect murder, Mr. Hale. You calculated the time, the place, the police. But you didn't calculate one thing. Someone who would look at objects, not people. That chair was your signature, and I read it. Hale remained silent for a long time. Then he took a deep breath and stood up. I knew, he said, his voice calm. I knew when you took the case. I read it in the paper. Sherlock Holmes investigates the train case. And at that moment, I understood. I was going to be caught. You could have escaped, Watson said. Why didn't you? Hale turned to Watson. There was a strange peace in her eyes. Because I'm tired, Doctor. I've lived for this revenge for 20 years. Every day I woke up, I thought of Moore. Every night I went to bed, I planned. And now it's over. Moore is dead. The plan is complete. But inside me, there's nothing. No peace. No satisfaction. Nothing. Hale walked to the window and looked out. The London night was dark and endless. Revenge, Hale said, his voice sounding distant, can keep a man alive. It was the only thing that kept me going for 20 years. But it can also kill a man. Slowly, from the inside out. I died 20 years ago, Mr. Holmes. Not the day I killed Moore, but the day he destroyed me. Holmes watched Hale silently. The man's face bore deep weariness, a spirit utterly spent. I have a question, Hale said, turning. Did Moore suffer? Holmes paused for a moment. No, he said finally. He probably felt nothing. He fell asleep and never woke up. Hale nodded. Good. I didn't want him to suffer. I just wanted to destroy him, just like he destroyed me. Half an hour later, the team from Scotland Yard arrested Marcus Hale. Hale didn't resist. He quietly accepted the handcuffs. As he was being led out the door, he paused for a moment and looked at Holmes. Mr. Holmes, he said, his voice calm. I want to say something. You caught me, yes, but you understood. Most people would have just judged. You understood. Holmes did not respond. He merely nodded slightly. After Hale was taken away, silence fell over 221B Baker Street. Watson sat down in the chair in front of the fireplace, his hands trembling. Holmes walked to the window and looked outside. Holmes, said Watson, his voice weary, this man did a terrible thing. But his story... Tragic, said Holmes, turning. Yes, Watson, tragic. Moore ruined Hale. Hale lived with that pain for 20 years, and in the end he gave Moore the same pain. But in doing so, he destroyed himself. Watson shook his head. Revenge never satisfies anyone, does it? No, said Holmes. Revenge is an illusion. It gives people a sense of justice, but it doesn't bring true justice. Hale killed Moore, but he couldn't get back what he lost. His career, his family. 20 years of his life. All gone. And now he'll spend the rest of his life in a cell. Holmes sat down in the chair in front of the fireplace. He took his pipe, filled it with tobacco, lit it. The smoke formed a heavy layer in the air of the room. "This case," said Holmes, taking a drag on his pipe, "taught me something, Watson. Routine provides a sense of security. Doing the same things every day, going to the same places, seeing the same people. It makes our lives predictable, controllable, but it also makes us vulnerable." "How so?" "Moore sat in the same chair every day," said Holmes. "That was his comfort zone, familiar, comfortable, safe. But it was precisely that comfort that killed him, because someone observed that routine, analysed it, exploited it. Moore's sense of security was actually an illusion, and that illusion cost him his life." Watson looked thoughtful. "So our routines put us in danger?" Holmes smiled, this time a genuine smile. "It's all a matter of balance, Watson. Routine provides structure, meaning, but a routine, followed, blindly becomes a prison, and sometimes a grave." Outside, the first light of dawn began to spread over London. The night was over. A new day was beginning. At 221B Baker Street, two men sat silently. Another case had been solved, but it left behind questions, thoughts, and sadness. "Holmes," Watson finally said, "I'm curious about something. Hale planned a perfect murder. If that newspaper sentence hadn't been there, if they hadn't written, 'found in the chair he used every day,' would you have taken the case?" Holmes took a long drag on his pipe. He blew out the smoke slowly, watching the grey clouds rise toward the ceiling. "I don't know, Watson," he said finally. "Perhaps I would have taken it. Perhaps I wouldn't have. But I know this. There is no such thing as a perfect murder. Every plan leaves a trace. Every murderer makes a mistake. Sometimes the mistake is big, sometimes small. Sometimes it's a fingerprint, sometimes a newspaper sentence. But there is always something." Holmes turned to Watson, and that familiar sharp gleam flashed in his eyes. "And my job," he said, "is to find that thing." Watson smiled, tired but satisfied. "And as always, you found it, Holmes." Holmes nodded. "This time, yes. But there are other cases out there, Watson. Other murders, other secrets, other shadows. And I'm waiting for them." Dawn filtered through the windows of Baker Street. A new day was beginning, and Sherlock Holmes, as always, was ready. But this morning, being ready carried a different meaning. Holmes sat in his armchair, staring at the dying embers of the fireplace. His pipe had long gone cold, and he hadn't touched the teacup sitting beside him. Watson recognized this state in his friend, that strange emptiness that came after a case was solved, the final tremors of the mind before sinking back into stillness. "You should get some sleep, Holmes," said Watson, rising to his feet. "So should I. This night has been long for both of us." Holmes nodded, but didn't move from his seat. "In a moment, Watson. In a moment." Watson didn't press his friend. He had known Holmes for years and understood that certain moments required silence. He walked to the window and gazed outside. London was slowly awakening. The first vendors were emerging onto the streets, workers were walking toward factories, children were running to school. An ordinary morning, ordinary people, ordinary lives. But at 221 B Baker Street, nothing was ever ordinary. Just then the doorbell rang from below. Watson frowned. They weren't expecting visitors at this early hour. A few seconds later, Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed on the stairs, and the door opened. "Mr. Holmes," said Mrs. Hudson, holding an envelope in her hand. "A courier just arrived. He left an urgent letter for you. A very strange man he was. Said nothing at all, just handed over the envelope, and left. Holmes's eyes instantly came alive. That familiar sharpness had returned. The gears of his mind had begun turning again. He took the envelope and examined it carefully. The envelope was made of quality cream-coloured paper. There was no address or name on it, only a red wax seal. Holmes studied the seal and furrowed his brow. Watson noticed the change in his friend's expression. "What is it?" asked Watson. Holmes didn't answer. He carefully broke the seal and extracted a single sheet of paper from within. He unfolded the paper and read. The expression on his face transformed first to surprise, then to concern, and finally to deep gravity. "Holmes!" Watson's voice was worried. "What's happening? Who is this letter from?" Holmes extended the letter to Watson. "Read it." Watson took the letter and began reading. But what he read was no ordinary letter. The lines appeared meaningless. Random words, disconnected sentences, illogical phrases. "The weather will be lovely today. Birds are flying south. 7 moves remain on the chessboard. Isn't sugar too sweet? The bear has gone into hibernation. Flowers will bloom in 3 days. London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. Stars shine at night, but the moon is not visible. Diogenes loves silence, but now there is too much noise. The king is in danger. The queen cannot move. Help is wilting like the rose in the garden. Time flows, but the clock has stopped. Brothers find each other even in darkness." Watson looked at Holmes in bewilderment. "What does this mean? This is madness." Holmes rose to his feet, a pale expression on his face. "No, Watson, this is not madness. This is a cipher. And the person who wrote this letter—" Holmes paused, his voice dropping. "Is my brother Mycroft." Watson's eyes widened. Mycroft? But why would he write in code? Holmes began pacing the room. His mind was working frantically, struggling to decode the cipher. "Mycroft handles the most secret affairs of the British government," said Holmes, speaking rapidly. "The secrets he knows could shake the empire. If he cannot write in plain text, it means only one thing. He is being watched, or worse." Holmes stopped. His face had gone white as a sheet. "Worse what?" asked Watson. Holmes looked at the letter again. He ran his fingers over specific words. "I'm decoding it, Watson. Look, 7 moves remain on the chessboard. 7 days. The king is in danger. The queen cannot move. Mycroft himself. He always uses chess metaphors and identifies himself as the queen. Diogenes loves silence, but now there is too much noise. The Diogenes Club, Mycroft's club. Something has happened there." Watson held his breath. "And the bear has gone into hibernation." Holmes's eyes darkened. "The bear is the code name used by British intelligence for Russia. And hibernation." Holmes swallowed hard. "Captivity, imprisonment." Watson stared in horror. "Mycroft has been kidnapped?" Holmes nodded, a rare expression of fear on his face. "So it appears. And flowers will bloom in 3 days. We have 3 days. I don't know what will happen in 3 days, but for Mycroft to write this, it cannot be good." Holmes set the letter down on the table and walked to the window. Outside, London continued its daily life, oblivious to everything. But Holmes knew that beneath the surface, in the shadows, far darker things were turning. "Watson," said Holmes, his voice ice-cold calm but storms hidden beneath. "This case will be very different from the Moore case. The Moore case was a story of 20 years of revenge. But this could be an international conspiracy. Russia, British intelligence, perhaps more. Watson came to his friend's side. "What are we going to do?" Holmes turned and looked at Watson. In his eyes, that familiar determination, that unshakable will, was gleaming. But this time, beneath that determination, there was something more. Fear. Fear for his brother. "First, we'll go to the Diogenes Club," said Holmes. "That must be where Mycroft was last seen. Then we'll follow the trail. Whatever the cost, we will find Mycroft." Holmes took his jacket and put it on. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by sharp focus. Watson also prepared himself, placing his revolver in his pocket. As they walked to the door, Holmes paused for a moment. He took one last look at the letter on the table. Among the lines, the final sentence caught his eye. "Brothers find each other, even in darkness." Holmes smiled slightly, a bitter but determined smile. "You're right, Mycroft," he murmured, "even in darkness." And he opened the door. Outside, the London morning awaited them. But this morning was different from all others, because this morning a new case was beginning, and this case might be the most dangerous case Sherlock Holmes had ever faced. As Watson walked behind Holmes, a thought crossed his mind. The Daniel Moore case had been a story of perfect murder. But the story beginning now, this could be a war, and in wars anything was possible. The door of 221B Baker Street closed. Two men stepped into the foggy London streets. Behind them, the last embers died in the fireplace, while ahead of them, unknown dangers waited. Sherlock Holmes, as always, was ready. But this time being ready might not be enough.